Hello out there. I'm Jonathan Winder. I'm here with Mike Deneen, and this is webinar number 4 in our Mastering Month 2015 series. I'm psyched that everybody could join in. We are broadcasting. Can we still call it broadcasting?
I think it's broadcasting.
Broadcasting across the interwebs from the brand new fancy iZotope mastering and critical listening studios where we make awesome mastering tools, and this whole series is brought to you by us on the iZotope education team. So thanks for joining us. Just to remind everyone, we've got a bunch of stuff up on the website. This week you would have found a blog that has to do with should the artist attend a mastering session. There's a series of presets, which are presets that I use to master Shay Rose's track from last week, and all kinds of other goodies, and I think we'll be selecting our grand prize winner, and I'll be mastering a track by them, so stay tuned for that. And also look for more stuff from iZotope Education in the future. We'll be putting together some courses and some ongoing office hours and blogs and ways for you to engage with us and answer your questions about making your tracks better, so stay tuned. So today's webinar, today's subject is, in some ways, it's one of the more important ones to me as a mastering engineer. It's about thinking about the artist and representing the artist's interest and thinking about how mastering serves the artist. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that that we have someone who can represent the artist's interests. There's a danger when we put on our mastering hat and are working on tracks that we start making decisions in a vacuum about what we think something sounds like, or what it should sound like, or what we're going to do to it. And I think in earlier webinars I alluded a little bit to the fact that you really have to sort of think hard about what some of the values are that are embedded in a mix or in a production or what have you. So anyway, I've invited Mike Deneen to come and help us understand that and talk about that. Yeah. Well, okay. Don't try, do, I think. Anyway. Before I go any further, you see up on the graphic here, there's a place for you to answer questions. We'll probably be chatting for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll take some questions from you. So please feel free to ask away, and you also have an opportunity to add comments and questions on the blog on the website after the fact if some awesome thing occurs to you later. So this slide says a little bit of something about where mastering sits in the production chain. There's a whole bunch of work that goes into creating the recording, and then there's the distribution side of things that happens on the back end, where hopefully the hopes and dreams and aspirations of the artist will be realized in some way, shape, or form. And we as mastering engineers sort of sit somewhere right on the seam, right on the interface between one and the other. And so in order to address all of the things that we're thinking about and taking into account, you see up here on the slide, there's a list of topics that we'll kind of wind through during the course of this conversation that I think look both back into the production process and look forward into distribution. And so one of the reasons I think, Mike, you're a perfect person to help us understand some of this stuff in this conversation is that you have worn so very many hats. You've been a producer's producer, if you will, someone who's been able to function in the sort of classic role of the producer, or several of them, whether it's helping with songwriting, interfacing with label, dealing with budgets, dealing with timelines, et cetera, et cetera. But you've got a record label and a recording studio. You functioned as the engineer at times. You live with an artist.
I do.
And married one.
And produced her records.
And produced a child, which is a whole different topic. And you've also occasionally even had to stand in as the mastering engineer.
I have.
So I'm
not as good at it as you are.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I don't know what I would have been doing.
For myself, I'm cheaper. So,
and we'll get to that. All right, great. And this is one of those conversations that I think people don't get to witness, or one of these things. You don't often get to see the behind-the-scenes conversations that happen sort of in the dialogue between the artist and mastering. So, and for folks at home, our assumption is that many of you are the artist and the mix engineer and the producer and maybe the record label and taking care of your own distribution. The assumption is that many of you are doing lots of different jobs and wearing lots of different hats. But I think it's instructive to think about each one of those hats separately and in the context of mastering to help you think about how to make good decisions as you march through the process. So before we focus on mastering per se, do you want to just give us a few words about the role of the producer in general, at least the way you think about it?
Sure. So the way I look at being a producer is it's the producer's responsibility is to deliver the record, whatever it is, a single, a track, an EP, a record, whatever, on time and on budget. And that's job one. Job two is to make sure it's good. And I think the tension between those things is really where the job of production lies, because obviously you want it to be good, but if it's never finished, it doesn't matter. So, and I think that one of the dangers of self-production is that I think you can get yourself out of that. You maybe pay a little bit too much attention to number two, and you lose track of number one, which is you really do have to finish it. And I think the trouble with finishing is one of the things that defines the tension that the artist feels in mastering, because mastering is the final step. So the producer's role is really to sort of help the artist make that leap and jump through the ring of fire and finish their record. And I think, and that moment I think is going to come up a lot in our conversation today, because that informs a lot of the stuff that the producer has to deal with when dealing with an artist and a mastering engineer.
Cool. So when you're inhabiting more than one role, where you're just not the producer, but maybe you're also the mix engineer, and so as the mix engineer, you want it to be as great as you can make it as a mix engineer. Are there mental tricks that you engage in to help sort of separate?
That's a great question. I prefer to mix my own stuff. There have been times when I don't, and it's a lot less emotionally challenging to not mix your own stuff, because you aren't as invested in every little aspect. So that's probably a topic for an entire other webinar. But yeah, certainly you do towards the end of a project, if you're producing and mixing, get pretty focused on the mix and the sound, and hopefully all the artistic and musical stuff you got right when you were producing, and then you can sort of move into mix mode. Right.
I just have a note here reminding me to say out loud, we also have a Spotify playlist representing some of your work.
Yep.
So I invite people
most
to go
of which
check it out.
you've mastered.
and it's been a great pleasure. Yeah. So, and that's again another topic for another day. So this slide, the tender artistic soul.
Yes.
So one of the things I love actually about working with you and the artists that you work with is that you are there to help the artists understand what might happen in mastering, and when they've approached this moment where it's time to let go. Right. So what's that moment like? What's the dialogue like where you?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult if you're an artist. The most difficult moment in the process is the moment where you decide that you're done. And in the old days when we were making vinyl records, mastering was a very removed process, because it just involved, it really was more of a mechanical process. It really just involved getting the recording getting the tape onto vinyl and then putting it out. And it didn't seem like something that was really part of the creative process. That's changed. And so the craziness, the artist craziness about finishing used to be more contained in the mixing process. That has lessened to some degree, and it's increased in the mastering process, because there is so much that can be done in mastering now. And there's so much, you can change a track so much, for better or for worse, in mastering. And so that has really become, to some degree, a repository of more of the tension that the artist feels about finally letting this thing go and letting it go out in the world. Because that's the moment for an artist where they are putting themselves up to be judged. So they have been working. It's been very insular, probably. Not that many people have heard it. They're focused. They're working on the track, on the record, whatever. And at some point, the fact that the world is going to be able to hear this, which is what they want, but at the same time, there's fear, and there's fear if you don't get everything right, that it will not be received well, and that can create a lot of head spinning during the mastering process.
So, is there anything you do to prepare the artist so that they can accept that moment of being done? The inevitable, there are probably a list of 30 things they're hoping for. They're not going to get all of them. Some of them are going to fall off the list.
Well, getting them to understand that they're not going to get all of them can be challenging. Because again, if we go back to my producer's priorities, number one, get it done. Number two, make it good. Okay, every single record that's out there could be better, right? There's something on it that could be better. But if you keep going and keep going and keep going and don't finish it, it's never out there,
right?
And that doesn't work.
Actually, and
that's why producers are valuable,
right?
Because our job is to make sure it's good, but get it done.
Well, this is also a great point. This comes into the mastering studio as well. At the end of every session, I have to remind myself that if I had 3 more days, I probably could eke like a little bit more out of it.
Well, in the mastering process, you're the artist, so
I have to have that sort of filter for myself,
yep.
or the parent that says, "No, that's good enough, honey. Let's move on now."
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there are times when I have to say that to you.
Right.
It's like, no, it's fine. We don't need another version. We're done.
Actually, that's right. And in that way, producers are very helpful for mastering engineers too.
Good.
That's right. That's right.
I'm
Because
glad to hear that.
we also like to have validation. That's right. So, what do you think? I mean, if you could encapsulate what the producer's role is in mastering, or in relation to mastering, what would you say?
I think the producer's role is to understand what the record is as a whole, because mastering. You have to remember that mastering is not like. You master a track, true, but there's also a flow to an album, and things like levels between songs and space between songs, it's all relevant. So you're not mastering individual tracks in a vacuum. They relate, and the producer has to have a sense of the overall. What is this record?
Yep.
What is it? How is it put together? And I think that's really important to go into a mastering session kind of knowing where you're going.
Can I play devil's advocate about that for just a moment? And this is something I get all the time, which is, and I'm sure somebody out there, in fact, we've already seen this comment in an earlier webinar about, but people aren't listening to records.
That's true.
All the way through. And so does that change something about your expectations or how you think about that issue?
Well, what I will say is the curse of shuffle mode for mastering is that everybody wants everything to be loud, because everybody's worst fear is that their song will come up and be quieter than the one before. Yeah. And I think that's really unfortunate. If you ask Steve Albini about loudness, he says, well, every stereo I've ever seen has a volume knob on it. Turn it up.
Yeah. Right.
What's the problem? And I think listening to an entire album, you sort of set the volume level, and then hopefully they relate to one another. Whereas if you're doing things with different records, you're competing against everybody else with whatever their level is, and I think that's a real problem. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
So this next question, I'm again going to try to frame it in 2 ways. One is to say, if there's a single person who's the producer and the mastering engineer, there's some dialogue happening between those personas, those personalities in them. So I guess, if we sort of break those into 2 different people, right, the producer and the mastering engineer, the question is, what do you look for from the mastering engineer as the producer?
Well, I'll tell you
do you ever sort of override? Do you trump mastering? And what's that interaction like?
I think the first thing, and this is both as a producer and a mixer, the first thing I look for, which is, as you probably know, the first question I usually send Jonathan mixes before they're done to say, am I on the right track? Because a mastering engineer with great ears can be really valuable, just telling you how, if you're, because, different days, you feel different things, you hear different things, and just sort of getting a sense that I'm in the window. Okay. Part of why mastering engineers are so valuable to producers is that, when you're making a track, you just want to know that when it's done, your mix is within the window of reasonableness, right? Kind of where it needs to be to sound like a record, right? Because if it's over here, or if it's down here or up here, it's not going to sound like a record, and you want it to sound like a record. So you want to at least, and you don't want to make the mastering engineer make that happen from something that doesn't fit. So you want to be in that box, in that window. Mm-hmm. So finding out and getting validation that yes, you're there. We can adjust it from here, but we're basically in the right spot is extremely helpful, and it makes you feel much better as a mixer once you get that validation. And then, what everybody wants from mastering is to have it sound even better than the mixes sound.
Uh-huh. Right.
That's what everybody wants.
Right. And that's hard to do when you get great mixes.
Well,
so thank you very much.
We try.
Yeah. Do you ever master yourself? Do you ever master tracks or records yourself?
Well, I have something that I call, I'll have tracks that are called FM, which I call faux mastering, which means I stick them into Pro Tools and just get them loud enough. And because I have learned in my professional life to never give anyone a track that isn't at basically CD level, because they won't like it. Uh-huh. And this started with A&R people, and it's just true of artists now too. Like you just can't give out, zero VU mixes to people. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't work. So you have to do some degree of gassing it and limiting it a little bit. So I have a little system that I use for myself. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I've ever actually mastered a record that I've produced and mixed myself. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't want to. Mm-hmm. I've done it for other people at the label, or somebody who just doesn't have the money to hire you or somebody else. But I don't think I'd want to do my own record. Mm-hmm.
So the next slide shows a directory. This is actually the Dropbox directory from the last Howie Day record that you worked on.
There it is, typos and all.
Spelling. I don't know. Spelling probably doesn't rise to the top of the list until the last slide. When we talk about metadata, we'll talk about spelling.
Yeah, that's when we depend on you to get it right.
Right. But I put this up because I thought people would be interested to see how many different versions and sort of what you provide to mastering. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about why there are multiple versions, and how many versions you might supply, and what kinds of things you just want to keep in your hip pocket just in case. Yep. And what are the variety of things that you might prepare for mastering?
So when you're mixing a record, at some point you decide, great, got it. And the artist says yes, and you say yes, and you're all happy, and there's the mix. That's probably going to be your mix. And we tend to mix both to half-inch tape and to a master link. And sometimes we like how one sounds, sometimes we like another sound. So we keep both of those versions. So they happen simultaneously, but we keep both. So that's two versions already of even the same mix. And once we've agreed, say it's mix 3, that we picked. We had 2 other passes. Something was wrong. We fixed it. We changed it. Whatever. We went back to mix 3. So there'll be the mix 3 tape, the mix 3 master link, and then everybody out there, I encourage you to do the following every time you mix a song. Every single time, and you don't think about it at all. You don't, just no thought whatsoever. As soon as you're done with the mix, as soon as you decide you're done, turn the vocal up 1 dB or 1.5 dB and run it again, and call that mix 3 vocal up. Okay, and you will be amazed at the number of times that will save you, because the one consistent thing that can happen in mixing is you even if it's just a line or reverse, something, the vocal just gets lost for a moment. In a track, if a vocal gets lost for a moment, you lose the listener. Mm-hmm, and it's mixing vocals is very, very, very hard. It's something you spend a lot of time on, a lot of work on, and it just can help save you later if you realize, oh my God, the vocal's a little under. Oh, never mind. I don't have to recall the whole thing and do it again. I have a vocal up mix. So I always do a vocal up mix. There are occasions where if your gut is this vocal might be too loud. Then you might do a vocal down as well. So I'm just saying that because on Medicine Ball we apparently did a vocal down.
Yep.
So, but I really think that that's incredibly. Do one or the other, but at least have two slightly dB and a half, whatever feels right. Don't think about it. Just turn it up, run it again.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that. It's entirely possible if it's a small enough move that you can edit in a verse.
Absolutely,
or you can edit
get it in
intro,
a word.
Right. That's right. And also, it's one of the hardest things to do in mastering. You can get the entire soundstage and tone sounding right, and you sit there and you think to yourself, "Man, this is awesome. I just wish I had a little bit more vocal."
Right.
And then if you try to go after that with EQ or whatever, it's just not as satisfying.
Right, and it's one of the conversations you and I always have sort of on every track is, do you want to use the tape version? Do you want to use the master? Do you want to use or the regular or the vocal up? And I'll ask Jonathan his opinion, and he'll say, "Oh, I think the vocal up's working better in this one," and he's always right.
Cool.
So it's good to have a few options, and it's good to have another perspective.
Uh-huh. And so I just want to touch on one thing. So when you print the tape and the version 2 tape or a cross tape, and I know sometimes people use tape simulation plugins and things like that. You don't change anything at that point. It's
that runs at the same time.
The mix is the mix.
The mix is going to the tape machine, and it's going to the master link simultaneously, and then we transfer the tape mix into the master link.
And what do you get from the tape? I mean.
You get a little bit of rolled off top, smooth, silky top. So it just doesn't. It's not quite as zingy when everything's recorded, directly into Pro Tools. You get a little bump in a certain part of the bottom, and then a little shave a little further down. That's how how do you hear it? That's what my tape machine, my ATR 102 does. Yeah.
Well, that describes a lot of what tape machines do.
Yeah.
And that low frequency contour changes depending on the tape speed, and you get some noise. And you get some nonlinearity in terms of, a little bit of soft knee something or other at the top.
The three things that I think are helped by tape are sibilance in the vocals, the top end of the cymbals, and the bass. I think those three things often just get nicer sounding on tape.
Yeah. Tape is fun. Tape is fun.
But if it's not always, sometimes the Masterlink mix sounds better. Masterlink mix can sound a little more open, it can have a little more air. So, and they're cheap converters, but they sound great.
Yeah.
I love them.
Yeah. Cool. Great. So, the expectations. So, I think we've maybe touched on this a little bit already, but I'm just going to throw it out again. So, what are your expectations? We've talked a little bit about getting feedback about the mixes, feedback about vocal up or not vocal up. Getting the flow of a record to go. Is there anything else you sort of want to throw into this topic?
I mean, the main thing, overall thing that everybody's looking for mastering is 4 simple words. Sounds like a record. Because what does it mean to sound like a record? I don't know, but you know it when you hear it. Some things just don't sound like a record, and oftentimes mixes, as good as they are. Maybe there's a little extra too much tub in the low end. Maybe there's a little lack of clarity in the mids. Whatever. These are the kinds of things that can be brought into that window I was talking about in mastering, and also sort of levels brought up, and then just a sense of sort of pulling things together and maybe finding any clouds that are in there, that any coloration from your mixing room, your control room, or whatever your headphones or whatever you're mixing on, things that you can't hear, that when you play it somewhere else you hear it. And the final thing I think is making sure that the tracks sound good on different speakers.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you something about that.
That's obviously you think about that during mixing too, but I think it is something, the adjustment of the overall tonal balance to make sure that your mix translates to different listening environments is an incredibly important part of mastering. Yeah,
great. And I think some of that has to do with the way you think about the dynamic range, and some of it has to think about tone. That's right.
Yep, absolutely. And that's what the artist wants too. They've just made a record. So they want it to sound like a record. And until it gets to that point, they're not going to be happy. They're going to be worried. And remember, they're fearful about finishing it and putting it out. So at a minimum, it has to sound like a record. If it doesn't sound like a record, they know that they've failed.
Yeah.
Right?
It's funny. It's so, I get what you're saying. I think a lot of people will understand that phrase, and yet it's hard to set, like technical parameters around what a record sounds like.
But if you're honest with yourself, if you listen back to what you just did and you're honest with yourself, you know whether it sounds like a record or not.
Aha. So
it's tough. It's tough when it doesn't.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out what to do better.
Right. So how did you learn what records sound like?
By having things not sound good and having people not like them. And having my clients be unhappy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you had to figure out, okay, what am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
What on earth am I doing wrong? And it's
a lot of self-examination.
It is, but it's a lot of listening.
Yeah.
I don't think enough. I often don't think enough is made of the importance of just listening, not getting so invested in what you did, but just sitting back and be the listener, be the person who's hearing it for the first time. Try to bring that perspective to it, and that will help you know what you need to do.
Yes.
If you're honest with yourself. Also, playing things for other people.
Well, I was just going to say, so one of the it's actually now a mental trick, but for me it used to be an actual physical trick or technique. And I still do this. So I'll be working on a track, and I'll get it to a point where I think it sounds reasonably good. And I'll do this on purpose. And I think to myself, I think I'm ready to play it for them. And I'll turn around and look at somebody else sitting in the room. And they don't have to say anything. And in that moment, I become aware of somebody else in the room. Sometimes I hear things a little bit differently.
Well, we talk about this a lot in talking about production. There is absolutely something that happens to us when we are listening as a social experience versus listening as a personal working experience. And for me, what I mix alone or with my engineer assistant. I do not have the artist there or the band there, but it's a very important moment where I bring them in. And that moment is as much for me to have them in the room and hear it differently, which I will because they're in the room, as it is for them to hear it for the first time and offer suggestions.
Yeah.
So they will have things to say, and usually they're valuable because they haven't been sitting in there the whole time.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to come in with a fresh perspective, but I also get a fresh perspective just by bringing them in. So it's just something because we are social creatures, and we are able to we have empathy. We can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, especially if they're sitting there, as opposed to when we're just zoomed in and looking at stuff. It's hard to pull back. It really having another person there makes it much easier to pull back.
So I've wondered sometimes if I just got a mannequin. No, anyway. So I know it's a little weird, but
let's not go there.
Okay, all right. So the budget. So this is an interesting topic, especially when you think about people who are doing their own work, because they're probably not paying themselves. But there's some part of my mind that thinks that if they thought that they were, it might create a framework or container for calibrating how much time they're going to spend and so on. But so I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the budget as it relates to mastering. You think about, and we can sort of talk about money or time or both.
Well, I was going to say, I think if we can broaden the concept of budget, budget involves money and time and everything, but I think really what we're talking about is limitations. And to create art, you have to provide yourself with limitations. I just believe that, and I think money is often one of them. But if you don't have to pay yourself, you can just do it forever. Okay, is that good? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Time. If you probably have other things to do with your life. If you don't, and you want to just do I guess you can do that. But I'm not sure it's a great idea. So give yourself a deadline. Give yourself a reasonable amount of time to work on stuff, and finish it. It's difficult to finish, especially when you're the artist, producer, and mastering engineer. That's a really difficult place to get to, which is why I strongly recommend hiring a producer. But that's a different conversation.
Yeah. Okay. So if you could just humor me, and let's say you have a budget of some number of dollars to make a record.
Yep.
How much of that budget ends up being spent on mastering? Again, I'm looking for a percentage.
Well, but the thing is that some things in the budget of a record are proportional, or
Depends
But
on the
mastering
record.
really isn't. I mean, it's more of a fixed cost.
I see.
I guess you could build in a certain amount of iterations or revisions or whatever if you want to have the option to go back 3 or 4 times and change stuff. You have a higher mastering budget, but to me, mastering is a little bit more of a fixed cost as opposed to a variable one.
Yeah,
So it's not.
I get your point. I mean, in my experience,
I mean, it depends on the number of songs, obviously, but that's really the variable.
Yeah, I mean, there are those unusual scenarios. Well, I won't name names, but there was an artist who you know who I'm talking about, who I worked with, who came in and said, basically, my record, I need you to save the record.
Mm-hmm.
And so take as much time as you want. And that's an extraordinary event.
I worked on that record.
Yeah. Well, but you didn't mix that record.
I did not mix that.
No. But that's an extraordinary event. That's not the sort of typical sort of amount of money, time, proportion.
Well,
of effort.
and this is a situation that does come up sometimes, which is that you finish a record and you can't work on it anymore, but you realize there's something very wrong with it. And that's sort of the surgery repair version of mastering, the save my record version. And it does happen. I mean, it happened in that case.
Yeah.
And it can happen on a track too. I mean, if we just, I just did a lousy, like I mixed 12 songs. I ended up doing a lousy job on this one.
Uh-huh.
Can you save it and
Right.
fit it into the rest of the record? Can you make it work with the other stuff?
Right.
I think that's sort of a subset of what mastering can be.
Cool. So this slide actually I put up partly because it describes a certain sort of pain point for me as a mastering engineer. So the typical arc of making a record, or so it seems, and this is like represents a classic mistake, is a band gets together, they've been playing for some amount of time, or they've got a fan base or some reason to make a record, and they think, let's make a record.
Yes.
And sometimes the next sentence is, we're going to release it on January 12th
Yes.
of next year. And so that gives us 15 weeks or whatever the amount of time is, and then they embark on the creative process.
Yes.
And all of this stuff needs to happen in that middle section, and manufacturing is a fixed, if they're going to manufacture, or getting the tracks prepped in any way to go out into the world. And then there's recording and overdubbing and re-overdubbing and re-recording and mixing and remixing.
Well, and as I've said a few times already, the most difficult part, deciding it's done.
Right.
And that can be both at the mixing stage, the recording stage, the mixing stage, and the mastering stage.
Yeah, so I'd just like to point out this ends up being a window about.
Yes, it does.
So I don't know. Maybe there's nothing for me to ask you to say about it, except for some sympathy.
What I would say is one of the things that an experienced producer, can really bring to a project is a sense of reality. Mm-hmm. In other words, what is realistic to get done? How many songs for the budget and the time available? Mm-hmm. How many songs can you do? What level of quality can you expect? And how do you get it done? Yeah. And those are hard questions. And my suggestion almost every time to everybody is, let's do as few songs as we can get away with, and make them really awesome, and get it done on time, as opposed to know what what we're going for, right? So that when you get it, you're cool and you move on. You don't try to make $100,000 record on a $10,000 budget, because that is just going to be a world of pain.
Actually, the thing you just said about fewer great songs, that's something I notice a lot when I'm working on records. Is when somebody brings in a record that has too many tunes on it, it's hard to make sense of it. Right.
Well, the best thing that happened with the demise of the CD was the demise of the 17-song album, because the only reason people did that before was because they felt restricted to 10 or 12 songs on vinyl, and then suddenly you could put 18 or 19 songs in a CD. So why not? And it was really a terrible idea. It just why not just record the good song, the best songs,
or have something in your hip pocket for the next record.
Sure, absolutely, or save a few. Yeah,
great.
So, which is also another mastering conversation. I mean, oftentimes you end up mastering, say, 13 or 14 songs, and then choosing 11 to actually be on the record. And sometimes you can't quite tell what's going to work until you've worked with the sequence and worked with the masters and see how things flow, and sort of get a sense of the whole package. Like what does this record say? Who does about the artist? Like what is it communicating? And that's going to be very different whether it's these 11 songs or these 11 songs or these 14 songs. So that's another sort of, not specifically mastering, but it can really all come together at that point because mastering and sequencing go very much hand in hand.
I was going to say, and I appreciate the fact that you always bring a sequence. You don't wait to come up with your first version of it
Oh, no.
in the mastering session, because if you do the math, 10 tracks, the number of possible combinations, I think, is 10 factorial.
It is, I think you really need to understand in mastering how significantly different a song will sound after another song, after one or after two different songs. It's really remarkable. If it's not set up right, the song just won't sound as good. And that's something that you need to find out by playing around with a sequence. And I recommend working on the sequence for about 2 weeks before mastering if you can. Certainly a week, and because you just try it, listen to it, live with it, try another one. With Howie's record, we went through a significant number of sequences prior to the final decision.
But that doesn't cause a mastering engineer as much stress usually as it does everybody else.
Correct.
So before we go to questions, because I see we've got a bunch of things here, I do want to take a moment and just talk a little bit about metadata. Hopefully, if nothing else, to clear up some confusion and answer a couple of common questions that come up. And this is the place to talk about spelling and so on.
Yes,
so
as a producer, don't send the wrong spelling to the mastering engineer because then it will go into the metadata.
It will end up ultimately being in perpetuity, and that's going to be the name of your record. Well, it can, but it creates all kinds of nightmares. So the kinds of information that can get rolled into masters in mastering and by the mastering engineer are CD text information, which is the information that comes up on a DVD player or a car CD player. It's a limited amount of information. ISRC codes, which are a code that's embedded in the data that's used to track digital radio, used to track distribution online. Every single track has a unique ISRC code that gets attached to it. You can actually apply for your own ISRC codes if you're a record label or an artist, or you can usually get them through an aggregator like CD Baby, or mastering houses can. We actually have at MWorks a license to distribute ISRC codes. But that's the kind of thing that can get included in the information by the mastering engineer. And then there's always a document that's got track timings and the correct spelling that gets sent back to the artist and the label and to the distributor as a way of double checking to make sure that all the metadata is correct and that the track length is accounted for, and if you're paying a license fee through Harry Fox, that it doesn't exceed the allowable time. And there's a lot of reasons that information is meaningful and important. The information that shows up on an iTunes playlist, that's not something that gets determined by the mastering engineer. So the ID3 tags are something that get added by CD Baby or by Apple itself. It's something that happens at the moment that the track is ingested into their system, and it has to be done then. So it doesn't make sense to ask the mastering engineer to create the final MP3 or AAC versions. We do things to create WAV files for better sounding AAC files. And then UPC codes are something that are really just for physical objects. If you can find a store that sells CDs, put a UPC code, or sometimes at live shows, they'll track inventory by looking at the UPC codes. But that's just a little bit of information about metadata. So I think we'll go right past the record label discussion and maybe dive into questions.
Great.
So let's see. The first question I've got here from Bob. I wonder where Bob is. If you're a musician and decide to produce, engineer, and master your own music, is it hard to look at your projects with an open mind? Well, I guess part of my response is, well, what does open mind mean? And in some ways, you don't necessarily always want to have an open mind. It's hard to step back from a track and get the objective assessment that you need to have sometimes as a mastering engineer. It's hard to sort of split your perspective so that you're both the person who's fully invested in the vision and then the person who can also assess it.
I think that's a really tough thing to do, and then I think there are very few artists who have successfully navigated that. I mean, you can count them, and, I don't know, Prince, Todd Rundgren, who else?
Yeah. I mean, there are some amazing electronic artists like
Electronic
Deadmau5.
stuff, yes.
But Deadmau5 doesn't master
Right.
Deadmau5 records.
Right. I mean, I think for me, music is an inherently collaborative process, and I think the energy between people and the getting other people's perspective, I think, is really valuable and important. So I'm biased. It's my view, but I think people like producers and mastering engineers are really valuable, and I think, to the extent that you can, involving somebody else in your project in some way is probably helpful. Again, if only that you have somebody else there that you're playing it in front of, and it makes you hear things differently.
Yeah.
Because that's the tough part, is the zoom in and the zoom out.
Yeah.
Very hard to do.
And, if you're not in a position where you can routinely engage a producer or an engineer, mastering or otherwise, if you can still, on a one-time or an occasional basis,
Mm-hmm.
get some feedback and some advice, at least you can start to understand what are the common kinds of, I don't even want to call them mistakes, but
Right.
tendencies that you have in your work.
Yeah, you'll learn something.
That's right. Yeah, that. Right. All right, Carl. How does realizing that you have to save a record affect how you allocate your time during the mastering process? Well, I think, it's it kind of answers itself. Also, if you think you need to save the record, maybe the first question you need to ask, and it's a question that I'll ask back.
Can the record be saved?
Well, that's one way of expressing it. But what I was going to say is there some possibility of rewinding back into mixing?
Right.
In other words, if you got to the point where you need to save it in mastering, and it's going to take 3 weeks to master that record to try to save it, and you're not going to get a great result anyway, maybe you take 2 of those weeks and remix.
And I'm sure that happens. I mean, you must sometimes just say back to the artist or to the producer, or whatever, you know what, you need to give another. You said it to me.
Yeah,
I think you need to go again on this one. It's not going to work.
Yeah,
that's fine. And in the days of recalls, I mean, it's much easier to recall things now than it was 10 years ago.
That's right.
So
right. I think also calibrating your expectations. I mean, setting your expectations realistically, because if by saving the record you mean making it sound like something that it's not, that's a recipe for disaster.
Right.
So, just sort of setting realistic goals for what you can do, because there are instances where people have either run out of money or time, or they're just still practicing, and they just haven't figured out, how to make a record sound as good as they will 2 years from now.
Right.
And so just maybe sort of getting some feedback from mastering, whether you're the mastering engineer or somebody else is, saying, this is as far as we can take this.
Yep.
So you don't spend the rest of your life trying to master the record. Let's see. Mark, should the artist not have input as to the sequence of the record? Mike?
Well, I mean, unless you're a kind of a super bossy producer, you obviously want to engage with your artist, and if you don't agree with them, you have to work with them to figure out the sequence. And in my last project with Howie Day, I mean, we spent a tremendous amount of time discussing the sequence.
Yes.
And ultimately, we came to an agreement, and I think we're both very happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very important thing. I think sequencing a record is really important.
Right. It seems like the obvious problem is that an artist has an attachment to sort of who they are and how they'll be sort of thought of, and then the producer, has to think a little bit about evaluating how they think the world is going to feed back to
exactly.
them.
So it's one of the things that producers do, which is try to align the artist's sense of who they are and what they're trying to project with how they're actually coming off, and try and get those things as close as possible.
Yeah.
So sometimes artists will make questionable decisions or about have reasons why they want some song earlier because of some word in the title that's too similar to some other word, so they want them far apart, when actually they're both really great songs and probably should be towards the beginning.
Right.
It shouldn't be on
That's a great example.
on the back of side 2. Yeah. This one actually came up recently.
Thomas asks, how do I find a good mastering studio / engineer, and what are some indicators?
www.m-works.com.
Yeah, well, but there's only so many of those.
True.
And so, I think, actually, I want to put a plug in for like listing album credits on websites.
Yes.
Listening to records that you like the sound of, and if you see that there's a mastering engineer that shows up on a bunch of them, that's cool. And word of mouth. And, what else is there?
I mean, with anybody you're going to hire in music, you're going to base it on stuff that you've heard that they've done that you like. So there's absolutely the same thing is true of mastering, the same as producers and engineers.
Great. Sorry, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Gelot or Gelo? I don't know. How do we know if we are underpaying ourselves? Wow. How much is the realistic amount for mastering services? I see a lot of numbers on the net. It's a hard question to answer, but I think we could probably all agree that we're being underpaid, just from the get-go. But one of the things, I actually just had a bunch of folks come here from disparate places, and we talked a little bit about how to think about the value of mastering, and I think this also is true for mixing. Mm. I think ultimately it's important that you figure out some way to define the worth of your work for yourself. You obviously want to calibrate the cost or what you charge people based on what the market seems to be. But I encourage people to go through the exercise of creating a spreadsheet that represents the expenses in their studios, the number of hours that they think they need to work, or can work, and expenses meaning rent, even if it's just a portion of your house. Calculate that as some kind of expense. It's a fiction, but it helps you start to understand, what this is costing you. And then once you put the spreadsheet together and you take a look at the number of hours and you say, well, I need to charge at least X in order to pay for my gear, mm-hmm. pay for my bills, and
pay for yourself.
And pay for yourself. That's
pay
right.
For your time.
That's right. Let's see. To what level should the artist? This is from Ross in Glasgow. He's up late. Should you ever sacrifice your own preferences for what the artist wants, even when you think it is wrong? So I think that this concept of wrong is an interesting one. On one hand, there's the creative side of right or wrong, and I actually love to keep my mind open and try to listen to what an artist wants, because sometimes they'll have an idea about their record that I would never have thought of, and it's really cool, and I have to try to figure out some way to get it there. Mm-hmm. But then there's also the wrong, which is there's just like so much bass on the record, it's going to distort through any speaker system it plays through, right, or whatever. So, you have to be able to at least protect an artist from themselves in that regard. And maybe the loud conversation is the place where this comes up all the time, where you can get it sounding great at a certain level and they still want it a little bit louder, so you push it a little louder and the artist says, it doesn't sound as good, but I want it that loud, and you have to defer. I mean, it really is the artist or the producer or the label's call. It's not the mastering engineer's call.
And I know you and I have had that conversation many times. I'm like, turn it up another dB, and you're like, doesn't sound good. I'm like, yep, I know, but it's got to be louder. Yep. So that definitely happens.
Let's see. How do you approach a project with various artists recorded at different studios? And this is from John. That's probably the hardest kind of project to master.
A compilation album.
Well, except it's a compilation. If it's a compilation by a single artist, if you have a compilation record that's lots of different artists and lots of different tracks, then immediately the audience, I think, understands that.
But isn't that the question? Various artists.
With various artists, yes, you're right. Thank you very much. That's not as hard. It's when it's with the same artist that it's especially hard, and that does come up.
Oh, definitely.
Like actually, Amy's record, "I'm With Stupid," that was mixed. I think 9 of the tracks or 10 of the tracks were done at Q with you, and then 2 of them came from the old Q. I think 8 of them came from new Q, and then 1 of them came from Blue Jay out in Carlisle. And it was.
What was that?
What's that?
What really?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's the last. It's All Over Now, or the last track.
Oh, it's safe.
It's safe. That's right. Yep. And so, what's challenging about that is that it all has to sound like Amy, and
Right.
Amy in that moment. And so, there's some real consideration that needs to be made in fitting that all together. When you've got different artists, now you're thinking about broader kinds of issues like level from track to track, making sure the dynamic range doesn't get totally out of hand, or the
The
tone
bass
or
level
the
and
timbre.
the vocal level are similar.
That's right. That's right. But otherwise, that's not as challenging, and it's actually kind of fun. It's fun to have the allowance to let things sound a little bit more different than they do by a single artist. Let's see. This is from Ola. What do you do to stay away from the routine so that your products stay current and fresh? The audience changes. How do you keep up with their expectations? Interesting. So, we can address this from the standpoint of both mastering and art and production.
That's a little more
I
of an
think.
artist question, I think.
You have a comment about it?
I think you should. I don't know that thinking about what's current and fresh is particularly useful. I think you need to be thinking about what you're doing and what you're getting across. And as long as you're being honest with yourself as an artist and doing what you think is great and what you want, I think you'll be okay. I think the second you start chasing what's on the radio right now, you're actually 18 months behind. And by the time you're done with what you're doing and you get it out there, you'll have missed the boat. So you're better off doing what feels right to you in the moment, and becoming part of the future than you are chasing the present, which will then be the past.
I think it's a little different for mastering, actually. I mean, whether we're thinking about level or the overall aesthetic of tone, sometimes people will come in and they'll want a record that sounds like a vintage record, or it sounds, the musical style is from the 70s. So take Amy Winehouse, for instance. Her music refers to music of an era.
Yep.
But sonically,
very contemporary.
It's very contemporary. And so I think it's important for mastering engineers to have some sense of what's current in a style if you're going to work in all styles, and be able to approach that and still figure out a way to maintain the aesthetic of the music.
That's fair.
Yeah. Great. Let's see. Bolin asks, do producers deliver instrumental and other versions of the tracks to master?
Yes, the one thing I forgot to mention when we were discussing the different versions is you always do a version with no vocals, just instrumental versions. So because oftentimes those are used for different things. I mean, sometimes you'll get requests for those for TV commercials or for film or any number of things. And if you have to go back and redo it, it's just a nightmare. So mute all the vocals and run the instrumental mix. And we also these days tend to do stems where we'll break out the drums, the bass, the guitars, the keyboards, the background vocals, the lead vocal into stereo tracks that can then be recombined. And those can be helpful for recalls if the label needs a change later, or if the artist wants a change later. You can more easily do that with stems, and it's easier than recalling the whole mix. Although recalling the mix isn't really that big of a deal these days.
Well,
The stems can be useful.
Yeah, I want to point out that a recall isn't a big deal unless it's 5 years later and you're on,
Absolutely
Pro
true.
Tools number 38,
Right?
With
and
with some
and all
new
your
plugin
outboard
format.
gear's gone, right?
So actually, flattening your tracks or consolidating or whatever you want to call it, making sure that you have stems and that contain all of the processing.
Yep.
That somebody can bring back together. And I know certain labels with their artists will require
absolutely,
those
they all
assets
require stems
in order to get paid.
Yep.
You need to provide them.
Correct.
Yep. All right, so let's we'll take one more here from Florian. What's the best way to find out if the client is looking for a noticeable change in character or for a transparent mastering job? I think my first answer is I ask point blank, so are you happy?
Yeah, do you like how it sounds?
Do you like how it sounds? And if they say yes, you can start poking at that a little bit more and find out what it is that they like about it, or is there some sort of consideration regarding the style, or you can get into the loud conversation with them. But the minute you hear yes, you have to assume that there's a lot about what's already built into the mixes and into the record that's in good shape. And so you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So I think just asking that question right up front. And
generally, I mean, as a producer, that's not a question you can answer for the whole album. It's like, these three I think are right on target. This one's a little off this way. I think these need to be brought to more like this. Because when you mix a record over a couple of weeks, things evolve and change, and maybe your first couple of mixes aren't as good. You kind of figure it out.
Yep.
You sort of get the low end right, you get the vocal level right, and you don't want to necessarily go back and remix them because it's close enough. You think it can be adjusted in mastering. So that's one of the things where mastering is really helpful in sort of just bringing things a little bit more together than they are.
Yeah.
Just
Now,
in straight mixes.
There's another sort of way of coming at this, which is if I'm working on someone's first record and they're just starting to develop their vocabulary around sound and mixing and so on, that's a place where I will feel freer to assert some larger kinds of changes.
Yep.
Where I'm willing to say, I'm hearing a significant balance problem here, or it sounds like this kind of record, but it's presenting totally differently. The dynamics aren't right or whatever. And so then I'll be a little bit, I'll feel freer to work harder on the record and change the sound more and help create the sound. So, you have to take into account who you're talking to.
Absolutely.
Great. So, well, we're not going to get to like all these awesome questions, but we'll invite everybody to weigh in on the iZotope Education site and the Mastering Month site, and bring more questions to the blog, and we'll be looking at those and answering them. And please look forward to more stuff from us here on the web. And so I just want to say thank you so much.
This was very fun.
It was very fun. And please, check out Mike's work. I love listening through your playlist and understanding sort of your role in creating the music and the work that you do. There's something really beautiful about the way the arrangements come across and the way the songs kind of are expressed through the instrumentation and the sense of proportion. And so, anyway, well, thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, everybody. And I guess this concludes our Mastering Month 2015, but we'll see you soon.